I know that the introductory verse that we had was a little odd, but I promise you that there's a reason for it. So let us go back to the book of Revelation, and we're going to go to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. Now, what is one of the questions that, especially when you're growing up, that we're very used to asking every single time? As we're growing up, I remember my sisters, when they were growing up, one of the questions that they had for everything my parents had to say to them was, why should I do this? There always had to be a reason. And when we go through the Word of God, it is very important for us to ask the same questions. Why is it that the biblical characters react a certain way? So we're going to go to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, and we're going to meditate on verse 3, verse 4, and all the way through verse 6. So starting with verse 3. And it says, "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So when we talk about names in the Bible, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Names is always equivalent to something in the Bible. Names are directly attached to who you are as an individual. What's your personality and what's your character? So this woman is sitting on the scarlet beast, and she has multiple names. Or we can also add she has multiple personalities, multiple characters. She manifests herself in different ways. And when we go to verse 4, it says, "The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication." And in verse 5, she has something written here. "And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." And then in verse 6 it says, "I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." And then something interesting happens to John. So John is writing this down, and this causes John to have a reaction. And as a matter of fact, this reaction is not common for John. When he sees the beasts in the previous chapters, which are very scary, John does not have this reaction. And how does John react? In the last part of the verse, it says that, "And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement." So John is receiving all of the visions. He sees, the horrible beasts. And all of a sudden, this specific woman that is sitting on this beast catches John's attention. When we actually go to the original language here in Revelation, we find out that the word for amazement is something very specific. It means that you're pretty much disturbed by what you're seeing. And what we're going to answer now is, why is it that John actually feels amazed when he watches this woman? So let us go back. In order to understand and to get a little bit of context, we're going to go to the book of Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12. And we're going to start reading from verse 13. So Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 13. So we have to remember that when the book of Revelation was written, it was written for a Jewish audience. So the Jewish audience were acquainted, obviously, with the Old Testament. And there was a lot of imagery. There's a lot of imagery throughout the book of Revelation. And also, there's a lot of reference, incidentally, to the Old Testament, and specifically to the sanctuary. So we're going to see a couple of interesting things here. And remember, the question that we're trying to answer is, why is it that John all of a sudden becomes amazed at this beast? So in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, it says, "Take heed to thyself, that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, but in the place which the Lord shall choose. In one of the tribes there thou shalt offer thy burnt offering, and there thou shalt do all that I command." So one of the biggest themes throughout the Bible was that the children of Israel had a hard time obeying God in regards to the offering. And one of the first instances that we see this is Who can help me with this one? What is the first time in the Bible where we have an issue with offering? We go back to Genesis, and we have a character that decided that he was going to offer something completely different to what God had asked. So, right from the get-go, humans have an issue worshiping God the way that God asks. And he decides that he's going to go ahead and offer fruits, the very best that he has. And what does Abel decide to do? He's going to obey God to the T. So now here in Deuteronomy, we see that God is being very specific as to how he wants them to worship. Now, there's a little discovery that archaeologists found not too long ago, and I wish there was a way that we could project this. But there's this place in Jerusalem, actually not too far from the Jerusalem temple, and this place is called Tel Motza, and it became pretty popular around 2019. So if we remember what happened in 2019, we had the COVID outbreak, and in Jerusalem they were building this road, and in this road, obviously they had to do several excavations, and they came across a very interesting piece of land. And in this piece of land, they began to find something that looked like the sanctuary in the Old Testament. They had like a little outer court. There was like a little altar. And then actually they also had like a holy place, and they had a most holy place. But what they found was that there was something that was a little weird and a little off about this. And one of the first things that they found was that there was this little figure, that it was a woman, which was obviously undressed. And the first thing that caught their mind was that she had no legs. So they saw several of these figures, and right beside those figures, they found some little horses, or that they appeared to be like little donkeys. And in Bible times, what did you call your donkey or your horse? You would call it a beast, right? So that was one of the first things that caught their attention. How is it possible that you could find a lot of pagan gods and a lot of pagan deities, and how could you find them in a place which seemed and resembled a place where you worship God? Well, as they continued to uncover more things, they realized that what the Jewish people would do is that when they had the sacrificial system right in Jerusalem, there were a couple of Jews that decided that they were going to have church that was a little bit more modern, right? So all the nations around them would actually go ahead and worship this deity, and the deity that they actually discovered in this place was called Asheroth. And there's a lot of variations about this little god that you go ahead and put on the beast. And the reason why it was very famous is because in the old times, Asheroth was the wife of Baal. So who remembers the story of Elijah? It was a huge deal, and it was very famous because Baal had a wife, right? And his wife was Ashereth, or Asherah. There was a lot of variations for her name. And it was very popular with the Jewish because the pagans had also a version of this kind of god. And what the Jewish would do is kind of adopt the pagan deities that everybody else worshipped, and they adopted it into something that was more familiar to them. And when they actually looked at this deity that they found in this place, they found that it was, how can we put it, a conservative version of the male and female gods that was found with the pagan countries. And one thing that they found is that while all the deities that the Philistines used to worship, these deities used to have a lot of goddesses, right? So these gods were often promiscuous. And this was very common in that day. So what did the Hebrews do in order to kind of adapt this system of worship? They simply said that God had a wife, and that God's wife was now named Ashereth. And by the way, God only had one wife. So they kind of made everything very conservative. The God was a little different than the gods of the pagans. And in Israel, this is when you begin to see a lot of the pagan worship that was adapted and incorporated into the worship of the Hebrews. Now, let us go ahead and see how God knew that this was going to happen and how he begins to tackle this from the very beginning. So we're going to go to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 to 3. And we're going to look at the language that God uses in this verse. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 2 and 3. And it says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. What was the very first thing that the Israelites did as soon as they exited Egypt? What was the very first thing that they had an issue with? They had an issue with who they were going to worship. And as a matter of fact, what did they claim when they were worshiping the golden calf? They claimed that the golden calf had taken them and delivered them out of Egypt. So God began to let them know, I am the one that brought you out of Egypt. Now we go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. What does God remind them again? In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So they're still having issues with this. Now we're going to go and see how is it that they begin to get involved with the worship of Baal and his wife. These mythological goddess. So we're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4. 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4. And it says, He removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves and broke in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it. And he called it, and I can't pronounce this word, Nehushtan, something like that. So when we go again to the original in 2 Kings 18:4, the meaning for the high places is exactly Ashtaroth, which was the female version of God that the Jewish nation used to worship. So we see that they're having issues now very specifically with this female goddess. And they're worshiping Baal, which is their equivalent of God, and they're worshiping the equivalent of the female goddess. Now, when we go to 2 Kings 10 and verse 27, what begins to happen here? 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 27, and it tells us, And they broke down the image of Baal, and broke down the house of Baal, and made it a draught house unto this day. And as a matter of fact, when you go to the excavations that they found there, who knows what a draught or a draught house is? Who knows what a draught house is? So a draught house is what we would know today as an outhouse. Okay. So what is the verse telling us right here? When we begin to see all of these reformations taking place, they do a very political and very interesting statement. It tells us that they broke down the images of Baal, and obviously Baal comes along with his wife, supposed wife. And what do they do next? They break the altar, and actually the stones that remain out of this altar, to make this statement even more interesting, they turn these stones into like an outhouse. And this was a statement to let them know, this is what I think about my people merging pagan worship with the worship of the true God. It's the equivalent of a place where you go and relieve yourself. And it's quite comical the way that this king did it, to go ahead and teach the people a practical lesson. And if you actually go ahead and look it up online, you go ahead and look Drought House and the altar, and you're going to see these stones, which you can't miss it. It literally looks like a toilet. And this is what they turned the altars of Baal and his wife. This is how they turned it into. So let us now go to, we're going to keep reading here in Kings. And I would like us to take a step back, and now we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, 58 and 64. 58 through 64. So as they continue to worship these deities and more specifically Baal and his wife, God begins to send to them messengers to letting them know that they have to separate this worship. He sends Elijah. He's letting them know that they have to decide whether or not they're going to obey God or whether or not they're going to go ahead and follow the pagan gods. So he sends them a lot of messengers, and eventually God has to make a decision as to what he's going to do with them. So he's either going to allow them to go ahead and continue to pursue these deities and deliver them to the kingdoms that hold these deities, or they have to make a decision whether or not they're going to follow God. So in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 58 through 64, it says, "If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law, or my law, which are written in this book, and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God," and then in verse 63, "you will be uprooted from your land you are entering to possess." So this is way before they enter into the land of Canaan. And God is already letting them know that if they decide that they're going to go after these pagan gods, he's going to uproot them from this land where he's going to take them, and he's going to deliver them to those kings. And in verse 64, "Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end to the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods." And remember, this is God giving his people exactly what they're asking for. If they were going to follow these gods, God was simply going to say, all right, this is what you want. This is where you're going. And then it continues to say, "gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known." So what happens? When we go back to 2 Kings 23 and 23 and verse 4, it says, "Then the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priest of the second order and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal." Can you imagine? They had actually gotten these pieces of furniture that they actually worship Baal, and they had put it in the middle of the temple of God. And so they're bringing these vessels out for Asheroth. Now here now she is actually mentioned. Let me see where it is. Baal and for the grove. Now, in this translation, when you go to several translations, you will find that some will actually call Ashtaroth a grove, and some will actually call her name. The reason for that is that one of the ways that they would worship the wife of Baal was that she was worshipped, interestingly, they would worship a pole. Right? This was one of the forms of worship. It was either a tree, it was either a pole, or it was either an altar. And here in this translation, it tells us that it's a grove. And then it says, "And for all the host of heaven, and he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel." So here we see that they're taking drastic measures. And actually, when we look a little bit deeper into what she actually stood for and what is it that they actually worship, is quite interesting. Because many times when we look at the mistakes that the children of Israel made, it's a little difficult to understand why is it that they would be so ignorant in the way that they worshipped. And I believe it's good that we understand why and how is it that they wanted to worship this goddess. One of the things that this goddess represented was the following. She represented, interestingly enough, she represented kindness. Who doesn't like kindness? Believe it or not, the pagan nations at that time, their whole thing was that they want to be kind. It's something good, right? We love kindness. There was something else that this god celebrated, which was love, divination, and foresight. Who remembers what was the thing that was promised to Eve when she came close to the tree? Remember, there's a lot of imagery in these verses. She comes close to the tree that was forbidden. What was the thing that is promised by the serpent to Eve? Which incidentally is exactly what people actually worship when they were worshiping this female deity. Which, by the way, we have to remember that this deity was the version that they wanted to make God. All right? What was the thing that the serpent promised Eve when she was at the tree? to be like God, and also the promise was your eyes will be open. She was going to have insight. And interesting enough, this goddess that they had actually made up was a representation of wisdom, foresight, love, divination, and kindness. So we can see how it was actually quite interesting and why it was very appealing to them. And another reason why this god was very appealing to them was because the gods of the other nations were very different. The gods of the other nations had multiple wives. And in a society where the way that you showed that you were successful was, first of all, if you had lots of wives. And the other way that you showed that you were successful was if you had a lot of kids. So, if you compared and contrasted at that time the god of the pagans, the Philistines, and all of those other nations that had their gods and a lot of goddesses and a lot of kids, with the God of Israel, which was only just one God, which God made it very clear that it was only one God, how do you think the Jewish nation actually felt? A God that has no wife, that is just one God. They obviously felt left out. And quite frankly, they felt that their God was not successful in comparison with the other pagan gods. So what did they actually try to do in order to kind of make themselves feel better and to also fit in with the other nation was very simple. You go ahead and mirror what the other nations are actually doing, and then you make a conservative version of that in the form of one God and one wife. Not a lot of wives, just one wife. And this is how the children of Israel begin to compromise with their beliefs and how God begins to instruct them, you have to let this go. I'm not a God like the other nations. I'm a unique God. And then let us now go to, we're going to see how is it, we're going to see now how something extraordinary happens. God finally decides that he's going to allow the children of Israel to go into captivity to a place where they worship these gods. And the Bible tells us they went through a lot of difficult times. People were killed, they lost their families, and finally they find themselves in Babylon. And then finally, later on, we see that they come back from Babylon. Many of them don't actually want to come back, but they come with a lot of trauma. And they come with a lot of trauma to the point where we find now ourselves where Jesus is here on this earth. And the Pharisees were very, very well taught now on what worship to God constituted. And we're going to go to Matthew chapter 22. Oftentimes when we think about the Pharisees, we often think that, the Pharisees were very mean, that they probably didn't have any tact, they were very legalistic. And we have to understand, why is it that the Pharisees came to that point? What do you think the Pharisees came to that point? Can you imagine after worshiping a lot of deities, after your family worships a lot of deities, and then you're taken captive to Babylon, and God lets you know that the very reason why you were taken captive was because you had other gods that were fake gods. They were not real gods. And this is the reason why you were taken into captivity. And then you finally learned the lesson. Thou shalt not have other gods before me. And here we are in the New Testament, and the Pharisees have learned this lesson very well, to the point where when we go to Matthew chapter 22, the Pharisees get together, they come to talk to Jesus. And in verse 35, Matthew 22:35, it tells us one of them, one of the Pharisees, an expert in the law, tested him with these questions. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? As a Pharisee who has learned from the stories from your parents that you don't worship other gods, otherwise you go to Babylon where they're going to enslave you, enslave your family. They want to make sure that Jesus actually knows this. And how does Jesus reply? In verse 37, it says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And in verse 39, it says, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And verse 40, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So, excellent. Jesus passed the test. They knew that he at least knew this much, that he only had that they only had to obey God and they only could have one God. So now, this is why they were very legalistic, because they actually went through a very traumatic experience to learn that there was only one God. But there was a problem. There was a problem that they had, and we find this in the case of the rich young ruler. When the rich young ruler comes to Jesus, he lets him know that he has obeyed the whole law. And the whole law meant that he only worshipped one God. So when he lets Jesus know that he has done all of these things, what is the first test that Jesus asks him to do? What is the first test? He asks him, well, you have obeyed the whole law. How about you give everything that you have to the poor? Did he pass this test? Obviously, he did not pass the test. And one thing that we learn from the rich young ruler is that while he had obeyed everything to the T, and he had obeyed the law, one thing was very clear, is that this law had not had an effect upon his heart, which meant that he really didn't want to keep the law. And now, with this understanding, we're going to go back to Revelation 17:3. Remember, we're answering the question as to why John was left in amazement. So we're going to go back to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. He sees this woman sitting on the scarlet beast. And remember, this is the very same woman that it's found in this excavation. This woman, you would put it on the feet, on this beast. And John knows exactly what happened to the children of Israel after they had worshipped Asheroth and Baal. And he knew the traumatic experience that they had actually gone through. So it's very fitting that when we go to verse 6 in Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, it says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And what does John react? And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. The reason why, one of the possibilities as to why John is marveled as when he sees this, is that now he's getting kind of like a flashback. He thought that the children of Israel had actually learned their lesson. He thought that finally, after being taken to captivity, they finally had learned the lesson that you don't worship other gods, that God is the only God that you have. But John sees in Revelation that, unfortunately, people in the end will be doing what? They're going to be worshiping this woman that is sitting on this beast. And going back to what this woman represents, it is very interesting to ask ourselves the question, are we putting in the place of God something else? Do we have something in our lives that is taking the place of worship that should only belong to God? And remember that all of these things that this goddess stood for wasn't necessarily something bad. Yes, there were a lot of bad things that they would do in the worship of this goddess, but many of the main ones were some of the ones that we can all agree. We can all agree on kindness. We can all agree on, let me see, which one was the other one? Wisdom. We can all believe in insight. There were a lot of things that this woman shared, and one of the biggest one was that she was the goddess of fertility, which means that for them and for the Jewish nation and for that the culture in that day, somebody that was very fertile was somebody that had a lot of money. And it is very interesting that when we go to the case of the rich young ruler, what was the biggest thing that he wasn't willing to give up? What he actually, his possessions, what he actually acquired. He had put in the place of God what he had earned. And that is why now John is super amazed. And we have to ask ourselves, what is it that I'm putting in place of God? Am I actually worshiping this woman sitting on the beast? Am I falling into the same pitfalls of the children of Israel? Because remember, for us is not a literal figure, just as the one that they used to worship. For us, it takes different forms. We all can go ahead and form a little god, a little woman sitting on a beast, something that we cherish, that we're not willing to let go. And perhaps, as the Jewish nation, there's a place that we have for this specific sin or this specific idol, metaphorical idol, that is very close to home. And remember that in the case of the Jewish nation, they didn't only bring this God to the worship of the temple, but they also brought it very close to home, to the place where they didn't have to go to the temple to worship God, but they could actually worship it in their own homes. And when we realize that, we see, first of all, we see the mercy of God that he had with the children of Israel, but we also see God's fairness, that God will give us what we ask. And may the Lord help us to examine our hearts and to ask ourselves, are we repeating the same mistake that the children of Israel made?